It seems like here on YouTube, the most important thing is gathering more gear and then doing more elaborate lighting setups for your documentary interviews to try to make them look as Netflix as possible. But that is unrealistic in quite a few different cases. The first is, if you're just starting out in your career, you probably can't afford a ton of lights. You don't have time to set up an elaborate 3-hour lighting setup for your documentary interviews. And the second is, in a lot of documentary situations, especially those involving real people, the more lights and gear and stuff that you set up around them, the more uncomfortable they become. And therefore you get worse actual content and the film suffers. Often it is the on-the-fly interviews that are the most intimate and create the best sound bites and tell the best story, which is ultimately the goal when you're making documentary films. So today I'm in this old historic home and I'm going to set up an interview with no lights and a minimal amount of gear to prove that you can make great looking interviews even without all that stuff. There are a couple big advantages for not using any lights in documentary interviews. As I mentioned in my intro, the number one reason is to make sure your interviewee is at ease. If they're just sitting at a table and just feeling like they're having a conversation, then that will ultimately result in a better conversation, a more intimate story, and better sound bites for your film. The second is, it's free. If you're not buying a bunch of lights and a bunch of gear, then all you need is a camera, a lens, and a few small items to make great looking interviews in any location. The third biggest reason is that it cuts down the setup time by 90%, which means you can shoot more footage and get more things in the can for your documentary. And then the fourth big advantage is if you are a 1 or 2 person team, there's just a lot less stuff to worry about while you're doing the documentary interview. Now, as I've advanced in my own career and shooting larger documentaries and doc series, I've really refined my skill set when it comes to setting up nice looking interviews. But when I first started out in my career and I didn't have a lot of time, a lot of money, and was often shooting by myself or with one other person, I shot interviews with no lights all of the time. So much so that even on branded content jobs for Marriott hotels, I would shoot interviews with no lights just because I had to get through so many different setups and scenes in a single day. I just didn't have time to set up elaborate looking interviews, but they still looked great. Even now, depending on the documentary and the space that I'm in, I will often do on-the-fly interviews, which basically means that when you're not quite in a scene and you're not filming life as it happens, but you have someone one-on-one, but you still want to do an interview with them to catch up on where they are, how the story has progressed, whatever it might be. And so you just sit them down at a table and have a quick conversation. All right, so there are just a few simple concepts you need to keep in mind when you are doing this. So we're just gonna go through them real quick in this old historic home and try to set up the best looking interview we can with no lights. So this video is all about setting up great looking interviews with no lights and minimal gear. I didn't say no gear. So minimal, we mean a tripod and a camera and some sort of audio capture device, even just something small like a DJI Mic Mini. The actual gear that we'll be using for the interview itself is simple, and honestly, if you're gonna get into filmmaking, you should just spend the 50 bucks and get all of these items right away because they're useful in a lot of situations. The first is a 5-in-1 reflector. You can find a bunch of these, and the most important thing about this, especially when you're setting up an interview with no lights, is going to be this black side for negative fill. And as we set up our interview, we'll see just how important that is. The next is a cheap lightweight stand or any type of stand. And this is so that you can also get a clamp, put it on top and hold your 5-in-1 reflector. Obviously you can set that on a chair if you don't want to spend the 50 bucks to get these 2 items, but it'll be much easier and way more effective if you have a clamp and a lightweight light stand. And then the next item is this item right here. It's very simple. It's just a light dimmer. So you plug the light in here, plugs in the outlet, and then you can dim practical lights using this mechanism right here. And that's really nice to have because practical lights will often give a really nice visual interest in the background, and they're usually in every location that you go if you're in someone's house or business place, but they're often much too bright for the actual scene you're going to be shooting. And so being able to dim those lights is really important. And then finally is curtains, and that can be sort of 2 different types of curtains. The first is a blackout curtain so that you can actually block all of the light that is coming through a window so that you don't get huge light shifts throughout that interview, or just a sheer curtain to diffuse the light coming through the window. And so we're in an old historic home, so there's quite a few different types of curtains around the house. So we'll figure out what works best for our setup, but I would always have a rod and a blackout curtain or 2 on hand for situations where you really need it. So when you don't have any lights, it might be tempting to use some overhead lights or lights that are already in the room, but that's usually a mistake because the quality is not great. There's like 3 different color temperatures on these lights. So one of my first steps is always just to go ahead and turn off any lights. And that will also really help in giving us some shadow areas and brightness areas so that we can actually get a more dynamic looking interview shot. So first step, turn off those lights. Second step is to find the available light that you actually have. And for us, we have these two big windows right here. Even if we don't have lights, we still have to apply the concepts of good lighting. And so having a reverse key, a soft diffuse light, and then also using that light effectively all applies. So you can either sort of think of these two windows as two options for key lights, or you just pick one and really use that as your main key. We're gonna really try to pick one, so I think we're gonna choose this depending on where we set our interviewee, and that will be our main key light. All right, so now that we have two options for our main key light, then we have to apply the reverse key method. If you're actually using a light in a documentary interview, it'd be key light, interviewer, and then the camera. And so if you can think of that formula, it still applies here. So let's say we have our key light here, and our interview sitting here, talking to our interviewee over here, then that means our camera has to be on this side of the interviewer, which then gets the light falling across the face of our interviewee and create a nice shadow side, which will also be on the camera side. The next is to find some depth in the room. If you don't have any lights to isolate your subjects, and that's one thing lights are really good at, you can just shine a light on them and make them the brightest part of the frame, then you want to get as much depth as possible. So I'm going to back myself into a corner or as far back against this wall as possible and use the depth of the room to my advantage so I can separate the subject from the background with the depth itself. I would often avoid shooting towards your available light just because you have no way to light the face of your interviewee, and so this would be pretty heavily backlit and the eye of the viewer will be drawn to the brightest thing in the room, which is going to be these two windows. Often for interviews, I like shooting towards windows because you can see some greenery outside, it gives you some sense of place, but that's usually only if you have a pretty darn bright light to combat the light coming in through the window. All right, so here's a pretty darn good angle. You got some good depth, you got nice light on my face, but it's also a little flat. And so now we're gonna figure out a few different ways to spice up this look a little bit with a minimal amount of gear. I think the first thing we can do is black out this window so that I have more shadow on this side of my face, and then that light will fall across my face more evenly. So we'll do that, and then I think our negative fill will come in really handy on this side of my face as well to deepen those shadows. And then maybe we can do some things in the background to either darken the background a little bit so I pop a little more, or just add some visual elements like practical lights just to create a little more intrigue in the background. So I will usually travel with a couple real blackout curtains. Didn't have any today, but this is an old historic home and there were curtains everywhere. So these are not full blackout, but they will do the job just fine. Also, another pro tip, always take photos before you start moving things around so that you can put it back the way that it was after the interview's over. This is the part where you watch me put curtains on rods. All right, so there we go. Not full blackout, but definitely cuts a lot of light coming in through the window. So now if I sit down again, already you can see if I'm facing the interviewee, there's already a much nicer shadow coming on this side of my face, and so that helped a lot. So if you haven't used a negative fill before, you may have used a bounce, either a white side or a silver or gold side, which bounces light back on your subject, so softening those shadows. And a negative fill just does the opposite. It actually deepens the shadow because it absorbs light on the black side. And then you just want to position this as close to your subject as possible so that it does deepen those shadows without it being too sort of awkwardly close and then actually be touching it. So, and if this thing flops out a little bit, you could just tape this down or bungee tie it so it's not flopping around too much. Looking at this now, we can see there is some deeper shadows on this side of my face, which is nice. So the reverse key method of the light kind of coming and falling across my face is working. If I turn my interviewee even a little bit more this direction, then you see that deepens even more. And so you actually are getting a pretty nice contrast ratio on both sides of the face. So by blocking this window, diffusing this one, adding in negative fill, and just positioning our interview in the correct location, this is already looking pretty good. But there are probably a few more things we can do, like adding in a practical light, dressing up the background a little more, and just tweaking some of the light, maybe with another curtain to see if we can get this looking really pristine. Well, that's as far as it goes. So we added a practical to the background. I moved it to the other side of the rocking chair just because it was crowding my shoulder a little too much, so I'm trying to create balance in the frame. But as you can see, it's a little too bright. So we either need to take down some of our curtains and create more light on me, or we just dim that light. So I'm gonna throw a dimmer on there and just dim it so it's a nice little practical in the background. So So there you go, here's our final interview setup. If I was the interviewee, I'd be looking at the interviewer who'd be sitting in this chair in front of me. And so this is what it would look like. And the nice thing about this interview setup is I still have a nice fall off from our key light, which is a window with some curtains diffusing the light coming through the window. And I put a negative fill here to deepen the shadows on this side of my face. And I'm still getting a nice little eye light from that window as I talk to the interviewer. So a quick recap of this interview setup. First, we turned off all overhead lights so we control all the lighting in the room. The next is we darkened one window and diffused another with just curtains we found around the house. And then we put a negative fill on this side of my face to create those deeper shadows. And we still used our reverse key method where we had our key light, which is a window, the interviewer, and then the camera. So the light is falling across my face as I speak to the interviewer. And then to add a little more visual interest, we added a practical light in the background, put our dimmer on that to dim it down because it was too bright at first. And so that creates a nice little backlight that is kind of falling across this table and creating a little more visual interest. And then the final step before we hit record is I opened up my aperture to give us a shallower depth of field just to blur that background a little bit. When you can't isolate the subject with light, it's nice to isolate them with focus. So if you have an f2.8 or faster lens, that will really help in actually focusing the viewer's attention on the subject. And this is it. This is the final setup. What do you think? Do you do a lot of interviews with no lights and very minimal amount of gear? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.